Hello friends, welcome to this lecture number 13 on the course on consumer psychology. Now this is section 2 of course on consumer psychology, and as we keep on telling you that section 1 dealt with basic consumer behavior and consumer decision making process. So in section 2 we are looking at psychological factors and how they modify or modulate the behavior of consumers into the marketplace. Not only from the consumer point of view, we also look at this psychological factors, how they affect marketers' perspective or how they affect the marketer behavior in the marketplace. So, that is what is of interest. Now, in the first two lectures in this section, we looked at perception, how perception affects behavior of consumer and behavior of marketers. We started out by defining product related features, stimuli related features, example color, taste, feel, smell, all those kind of things, packaging, how does it affect consumer behavior. And then we looked at consumer related factors, which are not limited to the idea of what a threshold is, what is Weber's law, how do we define stimulus generalization and stimulus discrimination, and other basic psychophysical concepts which are inherent into the consumer, how those factors actually affect consumer behavior. Further to it, in the next lecture, we looked at things like perception of price, perception of quality, perception of service quality, and other kind of perceptions which are prevalent into the marketplace, and how do they modify or modulate the behavior of consumers as well as the marketers into the marketplace. Next, we looked at a basic process of human cognition, which is memory. So, we defined what is memory in terms of what is long term memory. So, what is the semantic part of it, what is the episodic part of it, how is the organization of semantic part done, how is the organization of episodic part done, and what is the meaning of all this storage for the actual consumer behavior. Then we looked at how this organization of memory helps consumers to retain information, to perceive information, and to recall information. So, we looked at these three processes one by one, starting with how encoding different factors affect encoding of information, marketplace information. We also looked at how do consumers retain this marketplace information and how do they organize this marketplace information into the associative network using either an attribute based organization or something called a product based or brand based organization. Further to it, we also looked at how this information is recalled. So, we looked at the idea of retrieval cues, and we looked at how some psychological factors, for example, consumer motivation and others to name a few, actually help consumers remember this information. We also looked at certain factors which are necessary for the marketers to understand in terms of consumer memory, so that the product is of some use to the consumers. Now, the next part of this lecture, which is today's lecture, which will be focusing on something called learning. So, how does learning affect consumer behavior, and also how does learning affect the behavior of the marketer? Let us start with defining what learning is. So, learning, as explained in psychology, is a relatively permanent change in behavior which is caused by experience, right. So, basically this lecture, what we will do is we will look at what is learning. So, this is our lecture number 13, which is focused on learning. And so, as I define learning, it is a relatively permanent change of behavior, define behavior as BHR, which is caused by what? Experiences. Now, what is relatively permanent change? Why I am defining relatively permanent change? The reason why I am defining relatively permanent change is because if not reinforced, if not rewarded in some way, learning tends to go to unlearning. And so, that is why the idea of relatively permanent change, right. So, if not rewarded enough, if no positive feedback is achieved by the subject after learning, the learning is unlearned. So, first thing is relatively permanent change, and what is permanent change of what? Of permanent change of behavior. The next thing that we will have to look at is something called experiences. So, how is this learning caused? This learning is caused by experiences into the marketplace in terms of consumer psychology, or in terms of general psychology, it is caused by experiences that the person have, right. So, interactions the person have, and so these experiences could be internal experience or external experiences. So, all kind of experiences are there, and so that is what is learning. And so, what we do in the present lecture, in today's lecture, is we look at how consumers they learn about and develop habits regarding goods and services using information in memory. So, up till now we have looked at that information is stored in memory, right. So, by looking at product information in the marketplace, the consumers encodes it, retains it into memory and uses it for a later point of time, at a later point of time. But what he does with this information is interesting, and that is called learning. So, what happens is this information is used by consumers to learn certain behaviors, to learn and develop certain kind of habits regarding certain products. For example, developing brand loyalty, developing brand switching, and that kind of thing. To start with this idea of learning, let us first get some idea about what learning is, and as we move along I will also give you a little bit about the psychology of learning or psychology of different learning methods, and what kind of approaches that we will use in this lecture to understand the effect of learning into consumer behavior. So, then this is a basic definition of learning. Now, learning can be of two different forms. One is called the non-associative form and the other is called the associative form. Of course, there is a third form of learning which is called observation learning, and so we will be using all these three kinds of learning in the present context. So, we will be looking at the observation kind of learning, the non-associative kind of learning as well as the associative kind of learning in the present lecture. What is the difference? In non-associative kind of learning, behavior is developed for single stimulus, and so in non-associative the two forms are habituation, which is formation of habits, and sensitization. So, when behavior decreases for innocuous stimulus, for a horn, so if a horn is played again and again and then your startle reflex decreases, this is called habituation, you become habituated with it. And in terms of sensitization, what happens is a behavior is increased for an intense stimulus. For example, the horn is placed in a dark alley, the startle reflex that the horn will cause will increase, and that is called sensitization. So, habituation and sensitization, two forms of non-associative behavior, and as you can see the behavior is caused for a single stimulus, and that is why it is called non-associative form of learning. In the associative form of learning, behavior is the resultant of associating two or more stimuli. And so, the types of associative learning are classical conditioning, and instrumental conditioning. And so, classical conditioning and instrumental conditioning are two forms of learning that are of the non-associative form. What are they? In this, the behavior is the resultant of integrating two stimulus or bringing two stimulus together, and this link between the two stimuluses, two or more stimuluses, causes learning, and that is called the non-associative form of associative form of learning. And there is a third kind of learning which is called observation learning, and so the observation learning has a form which is called modeling. And within the habituation sensitization, you call these kind of learning as probabilistic. Probabilistic or stochastic form of learning. So, stochastic form of learning, classical conditioning and instrumental conditioning, and modeling are the three forms of learning which are available. And so, as I said, in observation learning, what happens is behavior is the resultant of observation. So, behavior is the resultant of observation of models who are doing that kind of a behavior. So, this kind of learning is basically happening when somebody sees a model or a person demonstrate that behavior, and if that behavior is rewarded in a particular way, right. So, this is the distinction of three kinds of learning. And so, in the present lecture, what we are going to do is we are going to look at three different approaches. So, we will use three approaches. What are these approaches? We will use the probability based approach, we will use the behavioral analysis, and we will use cognitive theory of learning to demonstrate how learning affects consumer behavior. So, three different kinds of approaches we are going to use. We are going to use a non-probabilistic method, a probabilistic method, which is a non-associative form and an associative form, plus a modeling form of learning. So, let us then start our class. So, the first form of learning that we are going to look at is probability theory. Now, as I defined, what we are going to do in this section is we will be looking at consumers learning and developing brand choices through information into memory, and that is what is called learning. So, how does the consumer use the information in memory? That is what is learning all about. So, the first kind of learning is called the probabilistic learning or the probability learning theory. And what does it say? It treats learning as the formation of habits. And so, what probability theory actually deals is that it believes that learning is a formation of habits. So, when a consumer uses a particular kind of a product and he gets benefited out of it, he gets positive satisfaction out of it, he develops brand loyalty, and habit formation or habit of using that product is strengthened. Now, for low involvement product, it is more of a habit, because then consumers do not go for brand choice or other kind of features, and for high involvement products, it is brand loyalty. So, basically this formation of habit for sticking to your own brand and not allowing brand switching or going from one brand to another is what is called probabilistic form of learning. And so, what is this formation of habit dependent on? How is this formation of habit actually influenced? This formation of habit is actually influenced by the strength of the reinforcement. What reinforcement are you getting? So, the more satisfaction that you get after buying a particular product, the more positive you feel after buying a product, the more amount of benefit that you get, or the more need arousal satisfaction you get after using a product, the higher the habit formation and the higher the chances of you being brand loyal to that product and not switching the product. And that is something which happened because of learning. So, you learn that if I use this product, what is going to happen? The probability of you doing that behavior again increases, because the more you do that behavior, the probability of success increases, and so people want higher probability. And so, there are four different cases or four different ideas that can be studied here. The first is regarding brand loyalty. And so, frequent purchasers are often brand loyals. Those people who actually buy a brand and again and they get satisfied with it again and again, they become more brand loyal. So, brand loyalty is actually development of habit or formation of habit, and this formation of habit, how does it happen? The formation of habit happens because each time you buy a product, each time you buy the product that you have been using, the probability of you getting satisfied your need increases, and so people who have making or who are making frequent purchases of a particular brand, they become more and more brand loyal. So, brand loyalty is an output of probabilistic theory of learning. The more you buy, the higher the probability of chance of satisfaction, and the higher brand loyalty is. The second factor has to do with something called brand acceptance. And so, what is brand acceptance? Higher volume users are difficult to win. What does it really mean? People who use a particular brand in very high volume are very highly satisfied with it, and they become brand loyal, and it is very difficult to shift the loyalty of these people. The only way that you can do this shifting of brand loyalty is by making them try new brands or new similar brands which offer similar benefits. And so, when they try new brands which are very similar, offers them similar kind of benefits, they think of brand switching. Otherwise, they have or they think of having the new brand acceptance. Otherwise, these people who have high volume usage of a particular brand, they are very difficult to win over. They are very difficult to made to switch their original brand into another brand. The reason being that high usage leads to higher probability of success, because it has that is what his memory says, that he has got satisfaction from that particular product, and that is the reason that since a high probability of success with his initial brand is, the higher brand acceptance of his usual brand would be. The third factor or the third output is called brand switching. So, low brand loyalty leads to higher switching. Those people who are very low on brand loyalty, those people who are not acceptable of a particular brand, who do not buy a brand very frequently, or there is enough time lapse between buying two different occasions of buying, those people have very high brand switching. So, more the time gap between two purchases, lesser the satisfaction from a product, the higher the brand switching, and that is what I have said. So, low brand loyalty will generally lead to high brand switching. Also, if you make a brand loyal person try a brand which is similar, offering similar benefits, and he gets satisfied with it, the higher the chances of brand switching. And the fourth factor that we can have a look at, or we can be aware of here, is something called new product forecasting. And so, probability theory or probabilistic theories also predict something called new brand or the success of a new brand, and that is based on the new user. So, what we can do is, suppose a new brand comes in, the more number of people, the more number of new users to that brand will actually give you a probabilistic forecasting of how the brand is going to perform in future. So, how many people flock to them and how many people keep with them initially, that will give some idea, that will forecast some idea about how many people in future will stick to that brand. And so, probabilistic theories, the probability theory of learning says that, because since more people are staying, so this brand is more of a habit forming brand, and so people of similar types will stick with it, and so that will predict how many people will actually stay with the brand over the period of time. And so, this is about the the probability theory of learning. The next theory of learning is basically the behavior analysis theory. And so, here I have some applications of respondent conditioning and operant conditioning, and so these are examples that I have given. So, we will go into this in a while. So, the example, let us first understand what is this behavior analysis method. So, there are two kinds of behavior analysis method. The first is called the classical conditioning. Now, what is classical conditioning? It is a form of associative learning. So, two or more stimuluses are associated together to form learning, and this is called the associated form of learning. So, in the beginning there are some steps to this classical conditioning. Step number 1, I have something called the unconditioned stimulus. And this unconditioned stimulus will be, let us say, food. The classic, I am using the classic example of Ivan Pavlov. So, Ivan Pavlov was a physiologist and a psychologist as well, and so what he was trying to see, he developed this idea of classical conditioning, and what he was trying to do, he was trying to study the rate of salivation in dogs after presenting meat powder. And so, meat powder is something which, or meat is something which makes a dog salivate, and what he was interested in is, he was interested in finding out or studying how does this meat powder or meat lead to salivation, what is the relationship between them. And in this particular juncture, in this particular in this particular work, he developed this theory of classical conditioning. So, how does this theory move about? So, in the start, the step 1, we have something called an unconditioned stimulus, which leads to something called an unconditioned response. And so, unconditioned and in this case the unconditioned response is salivation. So, presence of food or presence of meat leads to salivation, and this relationship is natural, right. It is unconditioned stimulus leading to unconditioned response. This is a direct relation, no amount of learning has gone into it, no amount of conditioning. Conditioning means artificial learning, conditioning means teaching someone to do something, and so the dog has not been taught to salivate. The dog normally salivates in terms of the unconditioned stimulus. In step 2, a neutral stimulus is taken and this neutral stimulus could be maybe a bell. Right. And so, this neutral stimulus is taken and then it is paired with some kind of a response. So, the meat, when it is presented to the dog, so here I am doing on the dog, I am studying what is the learning in dog, and so when I present the meat powder to the dog, he salivates, but when I present the bell to the dog, there is no response. What is the trick here? The trick here is to make the dog salivate for the bell, not for the meat powder. And if I can do that, if I can make the dog salivate for the bell and not for the meat powder, what I have achieved is called classical conditioning. What I have done is, I have associated two stimuli which were not paired together, which were not together to start with, and I have made, through my process of learning, the stimuli through which the dog was not reacting, which is the bell, he starts reacting to that, he starts showing sign to that. Now, in terms of my consumer behavior research, this is a very good example is the word free, the idea of giving something free, and so free basically has the power of because free attracts consumers, and so when I add free to something, it can make things sell basically. So, let us first look into this. So, this is the second step. In my third step, what I do something called pairings, and in pairings I present my unconditioned stimulus and then I present my bell with it. And then I have something called the conditioned response. So, unconditioned stimulus plus the neutral stimulus leads to something called the conditioned response. And so, this conditioned response is basically salivation. So, here salivation is the conditioned response, bell sound is the neutral stimulus, and meat powder is the unconditioned stimulus, right. And so, what has happened is I will do, let us say, 1000 pairings, which means that 1000 times I will repeat this step. So, this step has to be repeated for 1000 steps. Now, if I do that, I will come to a stage 4, where I just present the bell, which now is called the conditioned stimulus, and that will lead to the conditioned response, which is salivation, right. So, here what has happened is I will present the neutral stimulus, and the neutral stimulus leads to conditioned response, and that happens only after 1000 of these pairings. And now, what I have achieved from this is that, although look at point 2 or equation 2, where the neutral stimulus was not producing any response, but after 1000 pairing, what has happened is the neutral stimulus, which was not producing any response, produces the response of salivation. And this is the simplest form of classical conditioning, and this is what is used generally in most of the consumer behavior research, classical conditioning. So, what I do is that a neutral stimulus is added to an unconditioned stimulus, and the unconditioned power of the unconditional stimulus is basically extended onto the neutral stimulus, and the neutral stimulus acquires this power of eliciting response, and that is what is the idea, basic idea of classical conditioning, right. So, I hope you understood this. We will see variations of it. And so, one good example of classical conditioning is this. So, very effective demonstration in terms of marketplace. There are 3 stages. What I do is I place a musical jingle. This is my unconditioned stimulus, and this musical jingle leads to unconditioned response. So, favorite tunes, the Kingfisher tune, the Harley Davidson tune, the Audi tune, the Pink Panther tune. Some of these tunes or most of these tunes create positive emotions on you. For example, the Kingfisher tune creates a positive emotion onto you. So, this is natural, this has been pre-learned, right. Kingfisher tune is so good that it creates this kind of, or the tune of certain series, person of interest, for example, that creates a different mood altogether, a different positive mood altogether, right. So, this jingle creates, the musical jingle creates a positive emotion into person. What I can do is I can associate this musical jingle with my product, and the positivity, the positive emotion which is caused by the musical jingle is transferred onto the product. So, that is what I do pairings. I put the musical jingle, and this is my neutral stimulus. This brand of soft drink which initially was not causing any positive emotion, because the more positive emotion a consumer feels in the process of buying, the higher the chances of you becoming brand loyal and using it again and again. And so, this was not causing any positive positive emotions. So, I relate these two together, and these leads to positive emotion, unconditioned response. So, this is 1000 pairings maybe, or number of pairings. This is stage 3. Stage 2 is not depicted here, because alone this brand is not giving any kind of an effect. And so, what later happens is, if I do it 1000 times, at stage 3 this brand X leads to positive emotion. This is called the conditioned stimulus, this is called the conditioned response, and this brand has acquired, the power of what? The power of jingle, because jingle was the one which was causing positive emotion, and now this brand X of soft drink now makes the consumers feel positive, and this is simple example of classical conditioning into the marketplace. This is how classical conditioning actually works into the marketplace. Simple example of classical conditioning into the marketplace. Another thing to remember is that since this relation is artificially caused, it will not stay for long, and so what has to be done is you have to recondition, which basically means that this step has to be done over and over again at points of time. But if you do not do this step again and again, reconditioning is not happening, then this conditioning will be lost, this learning will be lost, which means that each time jingle has to be associated, or even after some time the consumer will learn that it is causing positive emotion. So, if something goes wrong, the jingle has to be used at times, because what will happen is the behavior will become extinct after a period of time. This kind of behavior will be extinct. So, some interesting facts: the number of pairings, strength of the unconditioned stimulus is dependent on the number of pairings. As I said, the more number of stage 3 happens, the more number of times stage 3 is happening, which means that the neutral stimulus is matched with the unconditioned stimulus. The more number of times this presentation happens, the higher the chances of neutral stimulus eliciting the type of response that you are buying, which means that the more the habit, the more the increase in behavior. So, more number of pairings, as the more number of pairings is there, the strength of unconditioned stimulus, the higher the chances of the behavior happening. Now, within this concept of pairing is the idea of forward versus backward versus simultaneous conditioning. Now, remember I said that the unconditioned stimulus is paired with the neutral stimulus to give something called the conditioned response. Now, the way this pairing happens, when should the unconditioned stimulus come, when should the neutral stimulus come, that sequence is what is forward and backward conditioning, right. So, what is forward conditioning? Forward conditioning occurs when the conditioned stimulus is presented first, followed by the unconditioned stimulus. So, if I have my neutral stimulus, if I have my bell presented before the meat powder, so bell plus meat powder leads to salivation. This is called forward conditioning. What has happened is a forward conditioning has happened. There is something called backward conditioning. The one process that we use is called backward conditioning, and in backward conditioning what happens is when the unconditioned stimulus is presented first, followed by conditioned stimulus. And so, if my meat powder comes first, followed by the bell, which leads to salivation, is what is backward conditioning. Now, generally speaking, this forward conditioning is very easy. Now, in terms of consumer research or in terms of the consumer problem, if the brand of soft drink comes before the jingle, this is called, and positive emotion results, this is called forward conditioning. But if the jingle comes before and the brand comes afterwards, this is called backward conditioning. Now, generally speaking, in terms of this conditioning sequences, forward conditioning is for simultaneous forward conditioning. There are two kinds of forward conditioning. We have simultaneous conditioning and we have called delayed conditioning. So, trace conditioning and delayed conditioning. And so, within the forward trace conditioning, sometimes also called simultaneous conditioning, the conditioning is very high, which means that the chances of the behavior occurring, chances of the required behavior that you want occurring is very high. Whereas, in backward conditioning it is of some type. And so, new versus existing products, this is how behavior is explained for new versus existing products. If a new product is there and an existing product is there, this kind of conditioning principles can be used to establish behavior towards this new products and existing products. There is also something called that we did not discuss, is something called simultaneous conditioning. And so, what happens in simultaneous conditioning is the jingle and the brand are presented together which leads to the positive emotion. So, if the jingle and the brand are presented at the same point of time, so it is basically time based thing. In one case the jingle comes first, followed by the brand and the positive emotion. In the other case the brand comes first, followed by the jingle and positive emotion. In the third case both come together and the positive emotion, and so this is called simultaneous conditioning. So, simultaneous conditioning is generally very weak, because it is very difficult for people to understand what is causing the response, to understand that, because these are all this conditioning, this conditioning can be explained in terms of expectations or certain kind of reward expectation from doing a particular behavior. So, this is how classical conditioning, this is what is classical conditioning, and this is the use of classical conditioning in terms of consumer behavior. Now, there is another kind of conditioning that we called up, or that we thought is called operant or instrumental conditioning. And so, what is this instrumental conditioning all about? The instrumental conditioning, what happens is, whereas in classical conditioning a stimulus is followed by a reward, a stimulus is associated with a reward which leads to positive behavior. In operant conditioning, behavior leads to the reward, behavior leads to the reinforcement. So, there in classical conditioning the reinforcement was meat powder, right. So, reinforcement is followed, or reinforcement precedes the presentation of the neutral stimulus, that leads to the positive behavior, the desirable behavior. In this case a stimulus leads to a particular behavior, and this behavior have consequences. Now, if the consequence is positive, the behavior is increased. If the consequence is negative, the behavior is decreased. So, a stimulus leads to a behavior, a person does something, a person brings a particular kind of brand, uses the brand, is satisfied with it, he will buy it, not satisfied with it, not buy it. Remember the jingle, I forgot the name of that, but it says पहले इस्तेमाल करें फिर विश्वास करें, kind of a thing. So, first use and then trust and form the belief, and this is that kind of learning. So, first use it and then believe it. So, you do that behavior, if the behavior is positive, behavior is leading to positive consequences, you actually will do that behavior again and again, you will get satisfied with the brand, and you will lead to, this will lead to increased buying, but or increased brand loyalty. But if there is a negative consequence to it, what will happen is it will lead to decrease in the desired behavior, and so the behavior will not be there. And so, these rewards, these consequences are of two types, we have punishment and reinforcement. And so, in operant conditioning these consequences can be either reinforcement for positive consequences or punishment for negative consequences. So, basically what is the idea here? The idea in classical conditioning, the reward was presented upfront, the reward was given to you upfront, the reinforcement was upfront. First the reinforcement is presented and then you do the behavior. So, chocolate is given to the kid does some work, this is basically classical conditioning. A kid does something good and because of that he gets a chocolate, this is instrumental conditioning. Behavior leads to consequences, positive consequences increases behavior, negative consequences decreases behavior, operant conditioning. Reward leads to behavior, this is classical conditioning, and so this is the definition of operant conditioning. So, what is the role of operant conditioning in consumer behavior? Operant conditioning or instrumental conditioning is a process in which the frequency of occurrence, the key word is frequency of occurrence, of a bit of behavior is modified by the consequences of that behavior. As I said, if a behavior is done, if you buy a particular product and the product gives you positive satisfaction, gives you the kind of satisfaction that you are looking for, gives you positive feeling, you will do that behavior, you will do those acts to increase that behavior, but if it causes negative consequences, you will not repeat that behavior, and that is the basic of operant conditioning. Now, operant conditioning is especially relevant to low involvement purchases, and so where the involvement is very low, in those kind of cases operant conditioning is very high, because you do a behavior, it gives you positivity, so you do not think about too much and it sort of becomes habit. So, low as I explained in the starting of it, low involvement products leads to high habit formation. So, people are not brand loyal, but they are more habit oriented, and so they buy it out of habit because the product is satisfying all their needs, right, and so they do not need to, and because it is satisfying their need, they do not need to think about, do evaluation, do get into this whole idea of consumer decision making, and that relieves their stress in certain way, and so that is they are doing what they are doing. So, operant conditioning is basically relevant for low involvement purchases. Now, behavior is most easily modified when little thought is necessary for adequate decision making. When you have a lot of thought, when you start giving lot of thought for behavior analysis, for understanding the results of any or understanding the consequences, then modification of behavior is very difficult, but when little thought is required, modification can actually happen. So, if you go to a particular store, you do not find your particular brand, it will be high on brand switching, you will actually switch the brand, because that requires because the similar brand or brand which you are moving from your to the other one, the one you are searching is not there. So, you are looking at a brand which is very similar to your brand, offering similar features. Here in this case, the brand switching will be very high, behavior modification will be very high, where the thought process is very low, where little thought is required for adequate decision making. In those cases, brand switching is very high. So, or behavior is easily modified. Now, there are 4 kinds of outputs or consequences, right. So, as I said, rewards and punishments are consequences from operant conditioning. So, there are 2 kinds of rewards and 2 kinds of punishments. So, a particular behavior leads to a particular kind of response, and what is the relation between them, I am going to explain it to you. So, presentation of a stimulus given the behavior. Now, if a positive stimulus is presented, so after a behavior, what kind of stimuli is presented, that is what we are explaining here. So, if a behavior has happened and because of the behavior has happened, a positive stimulus follows with it, this is called reward or positive reinforcement. So, you go to the market, you buy a particular product, something extra is given to you, a coupon is given to you, a mug is given to after buying a coffee set or buying a coffee bottle. This is called, so this is called the positive this is called positive reinforcement. So, positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, positive punishment and negative punishment, 4 kind of behaviors. This is called positive reinforcement. In this case, you do something good and you do a particular behavior, and because of that you are rewarded in a particular way, you do that behavior again and again, and that is what is called reward or positive reinforcement. If you do a particular behavior and a negative stimulus follows, right. So, you go to a shop, you buy something, and when you do that, that particular thing gives you a shock after using it, or that something after buying something you realize that it is broken. This is called negative, or this is called punishment, right. So, you do a behavior and because of this behavior a negative stimulus comes in, this is called punishment. You brought a product, you brought a toaster from the market, and when you used it, it gives you shock, this is called punishment, and so you will not do that behavior and again, and so doing the behavior leads to a negative consequences, and that you will not do this behavior because presentation, the stimulus that you get after it is basically a punishment. There are 2 more things to look at. So, presentation of a stimulus given a behavior and removal of a stimulus given a behavior. So, you do a behavior and because of that a particular stimulus is either presented or given, removed. Now, if you do a behavior and a particular stimulus is removed, how does that fare into? So, you do a particular behavior and a positive stimulus is taken away from you, it is called punishment. So, you go to hotel to live in that hotel and since you did not live in that hotel for a longer period of time, your membership is taken away. Some kind of upgrading is taken away, a positive stimulus is taken away. You go to a hotel, live in that hotel, but as a result a positive stimulus is taken away from you, a positive negative behavior happens, a positive stimulus is taken away from you, something that you desirable is taken away from you. You did not stay in that hotel for a longer period of time, and that is the behavior that you did, and because of that you are not given club membership, or you have taken away some prestige membership. That is what is happening here. And so this is called negative punishment, and then there is something called positive punishment. This is negative punishment basically, and this is positive punishment. In this case you do a particular behavior, and because of that behavior something negative, something that you won't want is taken from you. For example, you do exercises, and because of doing exercises something that you do not want is taken away from you, your weight loses. So you do not want the weight and it gets lost, and that is called positive punishment, right. And so there are 4 things that can happen. You can have a positive reinforcement, you can have a negative reinforcement, you can have a positive punishment, and you can have a negative punishment. So the difference is, in one case the something that you desire is taken away from you, and something that you do not desire is taken away from you, and because of that you feel good, is called negative reinforcement. But something that you desire is taken away from you as a punishment, and because of that you suffer, is what is called negative punishment. And so these are the 4 different kinds of consequences that can happen into the marketplace. So how rewards and punishments influences consumer behavior? What is the way in which rewards and punishments actually influences consumer behavior? So rewards and punishment actually influences consumer behavior through something called rewards and punishment schedule. Now what is rewards and punishment schedule? How often a reward or punishment is given to people determines what kind of behavior that you tend to do, right. So the more number of chances, since this is operant conditioning, a behavior leads to a consequence. Now the more frequency of this consequence coming after behavior, for each unit of behavior done, if you have 1 unit of consequence, this is called continuous reinforcement, right. And so there are several reinforcement schedule. Now reinforcement schedule is a schedule of rewards or punishments used for learning. So what happens is, a kind of reward, how many times the reward is given to you, or how much the reward is given to you. So it is time versus ratio, it is called ratio versus time, frequency and ratio, that is the 2 terms which is used. So how much reward is given to you and how many times that is given to you, that defines a schedule in operant conditioning, because operant conditioning behavior leads to the consequence, and so the number of times that you are rewarded, the behavior keeps on increasing. And so generally we never use something called constant reinforcement. For each behavior we do not generally keep on giving you constant rewards or punishment. We use something called intermittent schedule. So you have fixed ratio, fixed interval, variable ratio and variable interval, 4 different kinds of schedules. Now generally the schedules of reinforcement are, and so you can look it up, the fixed interval, the fixed ratio type, the variable interval type, and the variable ratio type. 4 types of behavior or reinforcement schedule which is there. In fixed intervals, after fixed period of time a reward will come to you. In fixed ratio, after fixed period of time a fixed amount of reward is given to you. In variable interval, after variable periods of time a reward comes to you, and in variable ratio, after variable period, after variable time, or not time, variable amounts of different amounts of rewards are given to you. That is the 4 schedule which is used, and this is called the intermittent schedule. Now in intermittent reinforcement schedule, rewards or punishes at least some responses on a fairly regular basis. So one of these, the variable ratio, the variable interval, the fixed ratio and fixed interval are intermittent reinforcement schedules. So what happens here is that you are not given constant reinforcements or punishments, the consequences that occur are not constant with the behavior, but some behaviors or some occurrences of behaviors are either rewarded or punished, and that is called the intermittent schedule. And so, generally speaking, in most companies or in most marketers, what generally happens is we start with something called continuous schedule. So, initially we give you punishment, or we give you, generally it is not punishment, it is only reward. So, we give you rewards for whatever behavior you do in a continuous basis, and then at later point of time when the behavior has sustained itself, what we do is we change from continuous to intermittent form of reinforcement. So, in intermittent form, some of the occurrence of behavior is reinforced either in a fixed manner or in a variable manner, and either after time based or ratio based. Now, with continuous reinforcement schedule, so one kind of reinforcement schedule is intermittent type, the other kind of reinforcement schedule is the continuous type, where the response occurs frequently. So, this can be used in your general consumer behavior research or in general consumer behavior statuses. What would happen is that in intermittent schedule, so you go buy something and you are rewarded, sometimes you are rewarded, sometimes you are not, and so the consumer gets attached with it. But you have to actually look at that breakaway point. There is a breakaway point. If you do not, if you are using a variable interval schedule or variable ratio schedule for giving consumers some benefit for buying your product, then you have to be very sure of something called a breakaway point. Now, there is a breakaway point if you do not give them reinforcements, if you do not give them something good to think about, after a period of time they will break away from you. So, you have to be very wary of that. But if you keep on, if you constantly give them rewards, they will not stick to your brand, right. They will think about that this brand is giving me too many rewards and why should I switch to you, and that is why you have these sales coming in. So, at period of time you have this sale, and this sale is actually a variable kind of a reinforcement schedule. So, you buy that behavior, the buying behavior in the sale gives you certain rewards, or buying during certain season, off seasons, sales and all those things are basically a schedule of reinforcement. So, two schedules which are there, one is the intermittent schedule where some behavior the occurring is always rewarded or punished, and the other one is all behavior occurrings are rewarded and punished. So, continuous versus intermittent. Now, how rewards and punishments influences consumer behavior? How does this rewards and punishment influences consumer behavior? One is shaping responses through rewards and punishments. One way of this rewards and punishments influencing consumer behavior is not only in terms of schedules of reinforcement, it is also in terms of shaping. So, what is shaping? Shaping is basically a process through which you give some good consequences, you give some positive things to consumers, so that they start liking your product, or so that they start liking your brand. Now, what is shaping? Shaping is a form of operant conditioning in which consumers are gradually trained to produce a desired behavior. So, they are given benefits, some benefits or an equal amount of benefits, so that the consumers start liking the product. Small benefits are given, or they are trained to like that product. So, sometimes they are given benefits, sometimes they are given this benefit, that benefit kind of a thing, coupons, price discounts, this, that, and different kind of benefits are given to them, so that they are trained to like your particular brand, and so that is what is shaping. And the quality and quantity of rewards or and punishment has also a role to play in consumer behavior. And what is this quality and quantity of reward? How much amount that you are giving. So, how much rebate that you are giving, what is the quality of reward that you are giving. Are you giving coupons, or you are giving something immediately free to them, bigger things. So, maybe China ball, or a dinner set with something which is free. So, the quality of the dinner set, it's Lau Pel maybe, so you like it and you buy it, it's Eagle, Milton, that kind of a thing which is free. So, how much quality you are giving free, and that quality and quantity has a good role to play with rewards and punishments. Two interesting factors to look at in operant conditioning. One is the process of generalization. So, what is the process of generalization? The process of generalization suggests that what consumers will actually do is that they will generalize product benefits of their favorite product to other similar products when their favorite product is not available, or even if their favorite product is available, the higher the drive of buying that class of product, the higher they will lead to generalization. So, if you want soft drink and there is a higher soft drink drive for a soft drink, what will happen is, given the fact that your initial soft drink is not available, you will generalize, you will buy a soft drink which is similar to your soft drink, and that is called product generalization, where you generalize features of your brand, generalize features of the brand that you like to other brands, competing brands, that is called generalization, or when you equate them together. So, the tendency to respond in similar ways to stimuli is called generalization. If two products are similar and your responses towards them, the feeling that you have towards them are similar, this is called generalization. Now, an advertiser building up drive from a product must be careful not to create desire for just generic brand, because if they create this, if a producer, if an advertiser advertise in such a way that the desire for a generic brand, desire for cola increases, but not Coca-Cola, not Pepsi. If he is promoting the ad in such a way that consumers understand that there is a drive, or consumers get the drive for a particular class of brand, then what will happen is, then it is not a good ad. But then what they should do is that the desire for the specific brand should increase. The advertisement should be made in such a way that the consumer craves for that particular brand, not the product class, not for all colas. He should not, the advertisement should not be made in such a way that the drive for cola increases, rather it should be made in such a way that drive for a particular cola increases, right. So, it is basically should be highlighting the product. So, advertisers should be careful for that, because what would happen is, if a desire for the product class is increased, then what will happen is high generalization will happen. Any cola will be accepted for that matter and not that particular cola. Now, to take advantage of the generalization principle, a company's product should be readily available. Now, if you want to use generalization principle, if you are a product which is similar to any other product which people are using and you want other people to buy your product, the first thing that you need to do is understand the process of generalization. So, advertise your product in such a way that it is competing to the already using product. And given that fact, you should also make sure that your product is readily available. If your product is not available at all, what is going to happen is that when people think of switching, people think of going to your product because the unavailability of the first product, or because the tiredness from the first product, then they will not go to your product, they will not show any kind of response to your product. And so, product generalization, take any advantage of product generalization, our essential principle is that the readiness of availability of your product. Right. So, generally speaking, what happens is that there is a graph of response strength and number of brand choice here. So, number of brand, let us say we have brand V1, B2, B3, B4, and this is the response strength. The more the number of brand that you have, the higher the desire, the higher the generalization. So, more drive, if the more drive that you have, the response strength, the higher drive. So, this is drive 1, this is the drive, and this is drive 2. So, the more the drive, the more the angle of this drive, because this response strength reflects drive. The higher the drive you have for a particular brand, the higher the generalization that is going to happen, because as the drive increases, the angle increases, and if the angle increases, it is going to more. So, if the drive is low, only few brands will be generalized to. If the drive is very high, more number of brands will actually be generalized to. And so, this principle has to be understood, this principle has to be taken in. So, this response strength or drive versus brand. So, more the drive, higher the chances of generalization, lower the drive for a particular product or product class, lower the chances of generalization. That is the principle to be looked at. And with generalization, there is another factor which is called discrimination. So, discrimination training involves teaching a person who instinctively responds identically to two stimuli to respond to each differently. And so, this is very necessary. It is necessary for marketers to use this principle of stimulus discrimination, because if discrimination cannot happen, if the consumer is not able to discriminate between the brand that he likes or some other brand, what is going to happen is that in those cases, the consumer will not stick to his own brand, he cannot discriminate between two brands. Now, discrimination is a process through which consumers restrict their range of responses and attach themselves to a particular brand. So, discrimination is taught to consumers through advertisements. They are these highlight, the product benefits are highlighted, it is made sure, the marketer has to make sure that their product is discriminated, because if their discrimination is not high, stimulus generation will take place, and so product loyalties will not be there or brand loyalties will not be there. And so this discrimination training is very important. The marketer has to make sure that, or the so that the consumer learns to discriminate between his brand and other brand. Now, when a products are generically equal and undifferentiated, the challenge is to encourage consumers to perceive one brand as different from others. As I said, when a generic brand is there, or when two products are generically equal, it is really a challenge for marketers to differentiate from their brand to some other brand. For example, two brands of chips. Now, it becomes very difficult on the part of the consumer or on the part of the marketer to make the consumer learn that two brands are different, right. And so that is what it is. And so I have discussed somewhere along these lectures the case where two brands of cola were there, and it was found out that on terms of taste people were not able to differentiate the colas, but then when given the brand names, when given the brands, they were able to differentiate, which basically proves that product differentiation, product discrimination is a tough task to achieve. The next learning theory is called modeling. And what is this? So, modeling is a process through which an individual learns a behavior by observing the behavior of others and the consequences with that behavior. So, in the marketplace, if somebody sees someone using a particular brand and getting rewarded out of it, that person uses or models that behavior or learns this behavior through modeling. That is called modeling. So, learning through seeing others doing a particular behavior and actually looking at the consequence that is happening out of it. Now, this modeling depends on four things. Characteristic of the model, how good the model is. If the model is not able to demonstrate the whole process of learning and the consequence out of it, the learning is very slow to happen. So, the better the model demonstrates this learning process, the better the model demonstrate what happens after doing something and what is the consequence of it, the better the learning is going to happen. Characteristic of the model behavior, how well the person who is learning from somebody who is actually showing the behavior, somebody who is actually demonstrating the behavior, how well this model behavior is. The more complex the model behavior, the more difficult for person to learn this model behavior. So, easier the behavior is, the easier that you explain that this behavior is or you understand that behavior, the better the learning would be. Characteristic of the observers. The observer also has to be good enough or motivated enough to actually learn. If the observer is not motivated enough, is not capable of understanding the behavior that is going on and the consequence that is happening out of the behavior, he is not going to understand the behavior. And so, modeling is also dependent on the observer, the characteristic of the observer and the consequence of the model behavior. So, if you do a particular behavior, what is the consequence out of it? If the consequence is positive, the chances are that you will learn the behavior. If the consequence is negative, the chances are that you will not like that behavior. For example, going to a movie, somebody sees someone going into the movie and then he sees that person coming out with a positive, after seeing the 3D movie he feels positive, he comes out, and so you learn the behavior that going to movie is a good thing, it is an entertaining thing, right. And so that kind of a thing. So, the first thing is whether the model behavior, or I give a good example of using the pull along suitcases. Now, the thing is that the pull along suitcases initially you have to actually use by pulling it. Now, the thing is, if you are pulling it, then you have to realize at what angle it has to be pulled. But the fact is that this model behavior, the better this model is showing you how this pull along is or what angle it is there, if the better way it is, the model is demonstrating it, the better the chances for the person to learn. So, somebody doing a particular behavior in the marketplace and getting rewarded out of it, if you can learn that and if you can learn how the behavior is done or how the model, how the behavior, what the behavior is which led to the consequence, the positive consequence that he has got, and also where if you have the capability to understand plus also understand the consequences, the better the thing is. So, if somebody helps someone in the marketplace or somebody does something in the marketplace and because of that he get a free coupon, somebody purchase something and because of purchase of 25,000 and above you get a coupon, you have to learn this behavior, and when you learn this behavior you have the ability to understand this behavior and the consequence out of it. This is called modeling, or this is called model learning in consumer psychology. And the last theory that we are going to discuss is called the cognitive theory. And what is the cognitive theory? So, the cognitive theory is an alternate to behavior analysis theory that emphasizes the thinking rather than doing aspect of learning. And so, here we do not do, as we saw in behavior analysis and classical conditioning and instrumental conditioning, what we saw is that we did something. We paired a neutral stimulus to a conditioned stimulus and behavior occurs, or we did a particular behavior and because of that something happened, something a consequence happened. So, all these were doing theory. Even for the probabilistic theory or the modeling theory, we learned something by looking at, we did something, we repeated that behavior again and the same consequences happened to the us or not, and if that happened only then we said the learning has proceeded. But in cognitive theory, that is what we do not do. We emphasize on thinking rather than doing aspect. And so, what the consumer does here is, he actually does, he learns in the way that first he forms a certain kind of a belief. So, it works in this way. Some prior beliefs are there for the consumer, and this prior belief leads to formulation of certain hypotheses. This certain hypotheses are then exposed to market stimuli, which leads to encoding of new information, and then if this is positive, it integrates and forms new belief. So, let us say I believe that analgesics cause remedies to headache, that is what my belief is, right. And so, a new brand of or analgesic has come which has antipyretic use also. So, it is basically can treat your not only relieve you from headache, but also can treat let's say temperatures differences, or can lead to lowering of fever, right. And so, my prior belief is that analgesics are only pain relievers, right. So, new brand has come in which has analgesic as antipyretic use, which basically means that it can also lower temperatures. So, what I will do is I will formulate a hypothesis saying that how this analgesic, this new brand of analgesic is also lowering behavior. So, I will have to first look at a hypothesis that what is the combination of it and what is the kind of drugs which are into this and into that kind of a thing. Then with this hypothesis that this new brand of drug X both lowers fever and also relieves pain, with this belief, with this hypothesis, I go into the marketplace and get myself exposed to information relating to the new drug, and I find out that it has both these properties, it has compounds which has both of these properties, and then it is supposed to do that. So, I encode this information, I found this information into the marketplace, I encode this information into this marketplace, the marketplace information into my memory and integrate into the already stored information. So, already stored information was analgesic is pain reliever. Now, a new brand has come which has analgesic properties plus antipyretic properties, which means that it lowers fever as well as lowers pain, and so I form a hypothesis about that, whether this happens or not, goes into the marketplace, and from there I collect information about what is the compound here and what is the molecule here and what molecule does what. Based on that, I encode this information to my earlier information that analgesics can only cause pain relief, and then integrate it with my prior beliefs and form a new belief. A new belief is that analgesics can not only cause reduction in pain, but also cause reduction in fever, and a new brand of analgesic is there which can do, a super drug is there which can do that, and that is basically how this learning happens through this cognitive theory of learning. So, how consumers turn these hypotheses into beliefs? The hypothesis that they create about a particular brand, a particular product which is out there, how do they convert this into some belief which is there? The first thing is familiarity with a product or service affect consumers' learning by making the consumers less likely to be influenced by new conflicting information in the marketplace. So, the more familiar a consumer is with a product or service, the less likely he is to be influenced by new or conflicting information. If you are very familiar with an analgesic and you know that in no way a new compound can be there which can do this, the higher the chances of you resisting to this information. Now, when experience is clear, low in ambiguity, when your experience of this using this product is very clear, the consumer learns quickly, and information in the marketplace only plays a secondary role. So, when you have high enough of experience, when you have enough experiences and the product experience or the product knowledge, if you are very high, in those cases you learn additional things about the product very quickly, and you do not trust on market information, you do it kind of a thing happens. And so, your hypothesis, whatever you have made about the product, it quickly turns into some kind of integration, some kind of encoding integration and formation of new beliefs. But when you do not have any experience about the product, if your product experience is unclear, high in ambiguity, if your experiences are very high, you do not have any experience about the product, or you do not have any information about the product, you are not an expert on it, what you do is that in those cases the marketplace information becomes the primary source of information, and in this case it is very easy to influence you. So, these are the brand loyal people, these are the brand switching people. If you have very high clarity about what a product is and what is the influence of it, in those cases you will it is very difficult for people to of this type to switch. But if you have very low brand information or experiences with the product, it is very low, then in those cases information in the marketplace, contrary information into the marketplace, can actually be used for shifting your brand loyalty. Okay, so in today's lecture what we did was we looked at what is learning and what are the types of learning which goes on into consumer into modulating consumer behavior into the marketplace and modulating consumer behavior of marketers into the marketplace. We started with explaining classical conditioning, a form of learning which is associated form, and even before that we use something called habitual learning, which is the probability based learning. Then we moved on to something called observation learning, and from there to modeling, and from there to cognitive theories. So, 3 or 4 theories, and these theories what they do is they use information from memory to make you learn, develop new product choices, or understand new products, or form new product beliefs and behave in the marketplace, or complete your transaction in the marketplace through information in your memory. So, this learning actually helps you in doing your behavior, or helps you in modulating your behavior, in shaping your behavior into the marketplace, so that you get the best benefit from the best product into the market and have a positive experience into the marketplace. In the next lecture we will look into 2 more psychological factors, which are mood, emotion and involvement, and how these mood and emotions actually shape consumer behavior into the marketplace, and what role does it have in terms of consumer behavior or consumer psychology. Thank you.